Uh, okay, okay. Hi, welcome to Little Fish, Big Pond, the official podcast of the Purple Koi Project.
I'm Caitlin and I use they, he, she pronouns.
And my name is Ta, and I go by she, her.
We're the co founders of the Purple Koi Project, and our mission is to provide an approachable platform to spread awareness about mental health, informing others while widening the lens we view our world with. Together, we want to make ripples in the world of mental health.
And today we're featuring a special guest.
Oh, thanks for having me. Hey, everyone. My name's Christian DeLuna. He, him, his pronouns. I am the Chief of Strategy for the Asian Mental Health Collective.
Hi, Christian. It's really great to meet you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Our current focus area right now is racism and specifically its impact on one's mental health. This first episode centers on racism against Asians. But before we delve into it, we'd love to learn a little bit more about what you do, Christian. So, could you tell us something about your work with the Asian Mental Health Collective?
Yeah, for sure. So I think first thing to note is that Asian Mental Health Collective, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We were founded, received status last year, so during the COVID pandemic. But we are comprised of a number of smaller grassroots organizations that came up together to form this umbrella organization to be able to provide help at the larger societal scale level. So this includes the Subtle Asian Mental Health Facebook group, which is a space for folks to be able to come and just share experiences, share stories, and receive community support digitally online. We have the Asian Mental Health Professionals group, which is a consortium of folks who are either veterans in the space or new to the field who want to be able to receive mentorship, feedback on just the career journey of being an Asian mental health practitioner. And lastly, we have the Waves organization group, which is a number of in-person meetup groups. Again, with COVID, we've had to shift a bit to online, but focused on the tenet of just being able to share stories, provide open space where there isn't any stigma. And then that kind of leads into the mission of the Asian Mental Health Collective, which is to normalize and destigmatize mental health in Asian communities. So again, all of these branches really do, we felt, laddered up into that one cause. So we wanted to be able to kind of be a point for folks to really focus in, so we can help reach out to any other groups, communities that are looking to expand out their work in their local communities as well.
Yeah. So I believe you already mentioned it, but we're sort of talking about waves. So, regarding waves, what inspired you to begin this project in 2019? Was it a specific moment that sort of acted as a catalyst, or was it the sum of multiple experiences that really convinced you something like this needed to be done?
Yeah, no, totally. I think the a bit of my story. So back in high school, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, been a 15-year survivor of it, gone through a number of ups and downs. And I think a big part of it was that realizing that how far community, both family and friends, helped me to keep on going and get to where I am. And a big part of that was just being able to provide that, and like at least in founding Waves, was being able to provide that community support for others who may not have that small bit you need to really just kind of push on for at least another day. It can be hard in the deep throes of things. So, but yeah, as far as the founding of Waves goes, it was based in New York. That's where I was living before I moved to the Bay Area back in December of 2019. So 3 months before COVID shut everything down. But yeah, me and my one friend, Eric Pai, who lives in the Bay Area now as well, actually. He founded a meetup group. I forgot what it was called at first. It was very generic. Asian mental health group talk space or something like that on Meetup. But there was an event in New York that was run by the Asian American Federation on mental health at one of the local museums. So they had a roundtable discussion where a bunch of Asian individuals, especially youth, came to just talk, have an open space to discuss their mental health experiences. And it just happened to coincide with the event that Eric was running afterwards. So we had our first roundtable there, where it was just a bunch of individuals who, if anything, just attended the event and wanted to kind of debrief, decompress afterwards. So we just grabbed lunch and just hung out. But from there, yeah, we've been doing a number of initiatives since. So with COVID, we've moved to an online format. So we've hosted a number of events over the past year. So we've had panel events. Some of them to note are on Asian identity. So in that event, we had invited folks who identify as different Asian backgrounds, just like from different lived experiences, to really dispel kind of what Asian means, since it's such a massive continent with a number of subcontinents to it. And then we also had a college series where we had college students come on to talk about their individual experiences across a number of different dimensions, including academics, peer relationships, family, etc. So yeah, again, we're really, really big on finding that outlet to provide individuals the chance to tell their stories, which is a very important aspect of mental health, and for me personally. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. What Waves is doing is honestly amazing because it really seeks to sort of address different demographics, like college students, or just like maybe people in their middle age, and to talk about all these different factors that can impact their mental health. It's really great. Um, so I think now we'll just sort of do a transition. Katelyn, if you'd like to take it.
Yeah, so our subject for today's episode, which is racism and how it impacts mental health in the Asian community. So, like you mentioned, Asia is such a large continent, which means Asian culture is incredibly rich and diverse. But at the same time, I think everyone can agree on that there are some traditions that harm more than help. As an Asian myself, I grew up in an environment that really stressed things like academic achievement and obeying my elders. So, how do these societal and cultural expectations shape Asian mental health and their discussion of it?
Yeah, no, totally. I think there definitely is a pressure that comes from growing up in a number of Asian households. I mean, I think there's very much that aspiration that comes from, I think we're getting a bit more removed from it now, but just being the children of immigrants. So that is a big aspect to it, where a lot of, at least myself, my friends, colleagues, their parents, uprooted from Asia to just completely start a new life, get a better life for their kids. And there is that expectation where they gave up everything and you want to be, or at least remove themselves from where they were comfortable. And a big part of it is wanting to be able to personally, to be able to make a better, to live a good life, to help them, especially when they're older, but also that expectation that you need to help them with because they went out of their way to help you. So I think that's a big part of the Asian story that a lot of other peers who might have families who've lived here for more generations may not be able to relate to. And I think that's a big part of the story to tell from the Asian lens about why there's forms of expectation that might be hard to deal with. And yeah, and I think in addition to that, there is just a high expectation for kind of the being able to excel, exceed. I mean, there's the concept, and this is something we're looking to digest a bit more in our upcoming conference next year. But one of our themes that we're hoping to explore is the model minority myth, which alludes to the fact that Asians have been attributed as being a very successful ethnicity, race in America, especially, and used as a comparison points against a number of other minority groups to say, why can't you be as good as the Asians, which definitely becomes a huge polarizing factor, which does lead to a lot of those aspects of anti-Asian sentiment just from out of that resentment. And I think a lot of it is just kind of when those barriers are set up, it does create tension that makes it harder to really talk across boundaries. So yeah, kind of deviating a little bit from the question, but there's definitely a lot of like expectation placed on individuals, especially young students, from both family and cultural, societal, which always in turn has an effect on the individual's view of self. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think something that's unique to, I think, Eastern culture is the idea of collectivism. And I think like the Asian American sort of identity is a very interesting intersection of where Western culture is more individualistic. So the Asian Mental Health Collective seeks to quote bridge the generational and cultural rift in many Asian families. So can you define better like what this generation and cultural rift is and how does this manifest in our mental health?
Yeah, no. I think one of the big things, so as I alluded to, there's definitely the immigrant status. I think that's a big one where we've talked about the fact that different levels of acculturation, be it if you're a first generation, meaning you came here and you're the first one to live here, 1.5, where you grew up in another country and then you moved here and grew up most of your life here, second generation, third generation. Those are wholly different views on society in the way and balancing that with, like you mentioned, that individualistic versus collectivist view to things. I think one of the interesting recent examples of it that had come to my attention is the kind of concept of the nuclear versus the extended family. So for just for reference, like nuclear is very much American individualistic, kind of from like the 50s concept of you have the mom, dad, and kids, very small unit. Whereas the extended family is you have, the mom, dad, kids, or any partner nowadays too, especially, and just the any other relatives living with the family as well. So I think that's a big part that's hard to balance, where you have individuals who do not. It's hard to balance that, where I think the expectation is like, oh yeah, you'll when your parents get older, they'll come and live with you, and then you'll take care of them, which a lot of I think my friends have accepted and really relish and enjoy. But that's a very strange concept for some of my other friends who are more Western, and they kind of like, oh yeah, my parents are just going to go retire. They have their 401k. They're just going to go live somewhere off else. And I think that's one of those things where it's that strange connection of like once you kind of like, especially like once you graduate college, this was another example. You move out, you do your own thing, and you don't live with your parents, which is, I think, something that a lot of folks, it's becoming more and more kind of acceptable just because of COVID and everything else going on. But that was very much a big one where if you're living with your parents after college, a lot of times in the States, a lot of your peers would be like, oh, you're still living with your parents. Whereas in like a lot of Eastern countries, that's kind of what you do. You live with your family because you're a unit together. So I think that does have a strong bearing on kind of how you see yourself and how society can see you, which again, everything always has that influence on your mental health and how you perceive the world around you.
Yeah, it's just really crazy because, I mean, I was born in the States, but my parents immigrated here from Vietnam. And it's just really interesting to see like the viewpoints that they have versus like my viewpoints on like certain aspects. So like when it comes to mental health, they have a very like, tough it out, um, I guess, approach. Like they're very, just try to bear with it um, like we grew up in a hard time, so it should be okay for us. But for me, it's like it's just it's a totally different way of like looking at the situation. Yeah. So in your opinion, what is really the best way to destigmatize mental health in the Asian community?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a, a big question. Again, I like our mission is to normalize and destigmatize mental health. So that kind of gets to the core of what do we do in general. But yeah, no, I think if I had to choose one thing, candidly, it's conversations like this, just talking, um, be it on like the individual scale, just talking with one other person. Because yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of resources out there. I mean, the mental health space, it definitely needs, there's definitely more room for it to grow and expand, but it's definitely something that there's a lot of resources, help that can be received. But if you don't know what mental health is, then you can't even receive it. So the awareness part has always been a big part of my mission, to be able to um, just know, like when I was younger, if I didn't know, if my parents didn't have to deal with mental health in our family, I wouldn't have known. And like even until I was, I think, a junior, I didn't know that I had a mental health disorder. And it was one of those things where it was, I perceived as like my own thoughts and incredibly destructive feelings, where just did not feel like I was doing what I needed to do. And it was something that, again, I'd very much internalized. And I think that's something that, again, I had someone who was able to tell me and step in like, oh yeah, there's something that like you can get help for this. And I think a big part of it too is that everyone, this is another thing I always say, is that everyone has mental health and we need to take care of it like we take care of our physical health. It's something that needs to be minded, exercised every so often. So, but yeah, I think a big part of that is to make sure that in order to destigmatize mental health, is we need to know what it is first. And that's something that, again, through storytelling or even just talking to one other individual, like anyone, just reaching out, that can make a world of difference in someone's life, which I have seen. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Honestly, I really agree what you said. Honestly, just having that awareness and realizing that, um, you know, we all have mental health and it can all um, affect us, even in different ways. It's just really important to have those conversations and start those conversations. Um,
I think like something I wanted to add about like depression specifically is that it's incredibly lonely when you perceive it as something that's only fought with oneself. Like, although recovery, like nobody else can do it for you, it definitely requires a whole community of support to really make it out of it and just manage it. Um, as a person that, suffers from it myself, I definitely understand like how powerful it is to just have that one person reach out. For, many of us struggling with depression, it's just being seen by one person, it's already incredibly powerful. But segueing back to
yeah, so we'll just make a small transition. So during the pandemic, the US saw a really alarming surge of Asian hate and Asian violence. There was a lot of pent up anger and a lot of racial stereotyping, and this caused extreme, unwarranted violence against Asian Americans. Building on this, how do you think racism and prejudice affects our mental health?
It's definitely another big question. um, yeah, so I guess let's unpack it a bit. So I guess from my perspective, one of the things, and this is a very big part for me, where coming down to my Asian identity. So I'm Filipino, and I think that's one of the things where, um, depending on the form, whatnot, there's no checkbox specifically that there are definitely more and more I've seen, but like Filipino or Southeast Asian, I think that's one of the things seeing more of. But I think just my personal experience of anti-Asian sentiments is that it felt not as removed, but it felt like it was one of those things where I know a lot of friends and who have experienced it, but it never felt as directly to me for some reason, just from that aspect of not what society, I guess, stereotypically, generically conceives as Asian, which is one of those tricky parts to it. But it's true though that, I mean, I've heard of a number of Filipinos who've also been attacked, but it is one of those things too where it's just, I don't know, across the board. Obviously, it's not something that's it's a very communal experience. You do feel kind of like that targeting, but I think that's kind of just to share where my experience was. It hurt to think that, oh yeah, like it's, yeah, no, because like I was thinking like about, sorry, I had just like a flashback to like this one woman who was a Filipino woman who was attacked in New York, about like my mom's age. So just like thinking, it's like, yeah, like even though like in my mind, it didn't feel like people were explicitly targeting Filipinos. Maybe they were, and this is like a big thing of unpacking, and for me personally, and that I've been trying to like cope through with the whole pandemic, my feelings on it. But at the end of the day, as an organization, we've been very big on providing support and resources to be able to help activate against it. So I think when the tragedy, the horrific events in Atlanta happened last March, it was one of those things where our community felt like they didn't know what to do. It was very disheartening. They knew that societally, like you really can't change anything, and that's why we were very big on mobilizing on the spot and hosting an event that weekend, a space for folks to just talk about what happened, um, and grieve, unload, and yeah, it's one of those things where I couldn't quite relate like like as explicitly, which again, this is like a big question of Asian identity, which is a strange experience, but like I definitely felt empathy for my friends and family. I have one of our management team. She lives in Atlanta. She was pretty close to physically to the shooting, location wise. So um, it's very close, obviously to all of us. And I guess going back to the question of like how, like why is it around? I think that's definitely steeped a lot more, and there's definitely a lot better people who can talk about the history of it. But I mean, from what I know, just a lot of it relating to model minority myth and the perceived um, achievement of Asian communities, and then going back to the whole where the origins of virus, like that definitely was a big spurring factor for a lot of individuals according to their beliefs. So obviously a number of events, perceptions that led to it. But again, I think at the end of the day, my personal mission is trying to be able to do what we can to help our community grow past it, whether it's having conversations in ourselves, but also, and this is another initiative we hope to have coming up in the next year or so, just being able to have more cross-cultural dialogues to kind of talk about and share these stories, especially in light of anti-Asian sentiment and Asian hate.
Yeah.
Bit of ramble on that one, but kind of invited a lot of self-reflection for myself, which sometimes like, and that's what I always love about these conversations. They get me thinking a lot of the time. And I mean, great questions, by the way. I just wanted to share that out to you, to y'all.
Yeah. Honestly, I was also reflecting with my sister on this, but when we first, there were so many hate crimes that happened in San Francisco, and when my sister was working there, and one time I visited her, and we wanted to go to this popular street, but then all of a sudden she was like, "Oh, actually, we shouldn't go there. We'll probably like something bad could happen." And that was sort of really the first time that I kind of hit home, relating to what you were saying about like it not feeling direct, but it's still affecting us. Like we hear all these things in the news, and it's odd because at first you feel sort of removed from these people, like they might be in a different place, or um, they might not exactly have your same heritage, but when you think about it, it really just ties into us as a whole. And like these experiences, even if they don't affect us directly, even if we're not the victims, it's still it still like really damages, I guess, our mental health, and it can definitely leave an impact.
Yeah,
I
totally.
definitely agree, especially since all of us are living in the Bay Area. San Francisco, like I remember as a kid, like always going to Chinatown. And during the pandemic, you always would be telling like your grandparents, like, don't go there anymore. Because I think the worst part about a lot of the Asian hate crimes is that it's literally just based because they are Asian. There is no reason beyond that they are. And it's just like the realization that it could really be anyone, although I guess that's a more pessimistic view, but it's kind of how it is with people. I think hate doesn't really discriminate, if that makes sense. And I mean, that's just ironic to say, honestly. But yeah, I think it's just incredibly sad how although maybe you aren't the victim of it, we definitely all feel this collective trauma whenever these incidents happened. And, it's not just now, it's just that the pandemic has just shined a better light on all these incidents because they have been going on for quite a while. And, like you said, with the origin of the virus, that definitely exacerbated the existing issue. Um, yeah, that's that's just my commentary on it.
Yeah, no, I think that brought to mind, especially like the concept of othering, where if you're not in the in group, then you're an other, which I mean, we all are. The way it goes is if you're not um, white American here, then just by sheer numbers, you're another. And it's something I think that even though I've never felt like I've been explicitly othered as being Asian, I think a big part of it is just based on my appearance. Filipinos, like I always joke, stereotype, I guess, that you either are more on the Hispanic end or more on the Asian end. I like just because Spanish colonization for 300 years will do that to you. But yeah, no, I definitely feel, and I've been told I look more Hispanic, whereas my sister looks more typical Asian kind of traits. And that's where I think, but just still feeling like an other though. I think that's a big part where I walk into a space. That was one thing, like I first had that experience real in college and it wasn't really like overt or malicious or anything, but I like walked into a small classroom and I'm like, wow, I'm the only minority here. And it was very just notable. I was just like, wow, okay. That's fine. I thankfully have never been explicitly called out for it, which I know a number of my peers have. But it's that feeling that you walk into a place and you're not the majority. You're other. That's the part of the experience that is important to relate. That weighs on our collective mental health, no matter what minority group you identify with. And that's why I'm very big on getting to those cross-cultural communications because, yeah, everyone has their own sorted backgrounds, especially dealing with this. And a lot of times it's pitted as a who had it worst kind of thing. And it's hard to do that. And it's not something that it's hard for folks to kind of really put away, but it's something that at least needs to be talked about and heard because it is something we all do have in common, that experience of othering, whether it's intentional or not. And yeah, I think that is one of those, it's just a hard thing. It's like you mentioned, like there are times where I don't feel like going to places just because I'm like, I know I'm going to stand out. and I just rather would not want to invite that attention to people I meet, probably the nicest people I'll ever meet, but it's just that fear of not knowing intent that is really, I'd say sad is the best way to describe it. The fact that I just have internalized the fact that I don't feel comfortable. And that's, yeah, I think that's something that is big on trying. I think that's to try and improve that. I don't know how. It's a very big societal, cultural feeling. So, but yeah.
Going back to what you mentioned a little bit earlier about just like covert and overt racism. Um, so more about how people perceive this, I guess. A lot of people think that racism, when it occurs, it's obvious and it stands out. And whether it's just blatant violence or using racial slurs or having explicit discrimination. But really, racism can be subtle as well. How does covert racism damage one's mental health, and is its impact different from overt racism?
Yeah, no, great question. I think so. Going, I guess, back to that again, covert racism very tied to the fact that you're an other in a space, and a lot of it is just like not even realizing that that I think for a lot of folks that they do have ingrained stereotypes. I mean, even myself, obviously, like I have, like we all do, like this, the way society is structured, like you think of a group and you have an automatic thought to it, like, oh yeah, these people, that's the trait associated with them. And it's hard to break that. And the way to break that is by hearing stories about it and being exposed to more people of different backgrounds. So as far as damaging to the mental health, to your mental health goes, it has a different effect, I would say. Not to be like the all-knowing prescriptive, like this is how it is, but my take on it is that like obviously an overt act is incredibly traumatic, more likely to develop something ingrained. But I think a lot of covert like side glances, somebody just like you feel like they're looking at you in a different way, those I feel like get internalized a lot more over time. And as opposed to like you have this one trigger moment event of that like constantly gives you flashbacks. I think the covert acts against you really kind of develop over the years and can erode away at you if you don't have an outlet to talk about them. Yeah, I think it, like I said, it's one of those things that for me, like over the years, I've just become like fearful about going to, for myself and for my family, of going to some places just because like what has like just developed over the years in myself and what I perceive in society. And I think that's a big aspect to it where, yeah, it's definitely had a harmful effect in terms of how I see others and my kind of like openness and willingness to be able to trust others, which is I think the important part of being able to dispel it, but it's being able to bridge those gaps that I think covert racism really inhibits. So, you know, kind of some musings on that.
Yeah, so just wanted to go into digital platforms because they have been incredibly important during COVID. In the recent years, digital platforms have become such powerful tools in reaching larger audiences. You know, we can connect with people across the world in just a matter of seconds. But like, how can this technology be used to destigmatize mental health?
Yeah, no, totally. So, I mean, to start, our Subtle Asian Mental Health Facebook group or Asian Mental Health Collective Instagram accounts has been very big in just reaching people. Again, a big part of the move towards destigmatization is awareness first and foremost. It's just trying to be able to reach people and say, hey, this is a thing. I think one of the big things that we're facing now is we definitely do a lot of not preaching to the choir, but we reach the people who want to be reached. It's kind of a self-selecting group of like, oh yeah, like I'm interested in this and I want to find out more about it. But like I said, everyone has mental health, and we're trying to figure out how to reach those other groups that don't tap into this space. And there are means through digital for sure. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out now. But yeah, as far as digital goes, I think that's been, especially during COVID time, been helpful to have those online spaces to really connect, share information. And again, like the Waves group, we've done a lot of online programming. We've had a number of panels, roundtable discussions, and a lot of the events have drawn in people globally. We've had people up at like 3 o'clock in the morning in Asia. People in Europe come to our events just because they're looking for anyone to connect with, to just chat, share, especially in isolation. So yeah, I mean, I think that's been a big part of how, at least the approach of Asian Mental Health Collective, like using those platforms to reach people where they're at. But again, I think a big part of it is now how do we reach the people who like aren't kind of geared towards the space, but are still out there. And I think digital is a way to approach that gap, because at least as compared to like physical, I think it'd be probably harder to get folks to kind of show up to it. Like that's even more self-selecting, but there might be more of an opportunity to stumble across people in their own digital spaces and be able to share some light, shed some light on stories through those avenues online.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because, like you said, with your platform right now with the mental health collective, it's very self-selecting. Like people have to seek it out on their own. I think one thing that plays a part is just that with news outlets, like something I've noticed like over quarantine is that like these movements such as Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, they have like a peak in the news and then they die out rather quickly, even though things keep going on. And, you know, I'm really glad that the Asian Mental Health Collective exists because your network is so large. And as you guys are expanding, you know, I think any minority group is trying to get to the point where you can reach people who just like the news, where it's like you're not necessarily trying to be reached. It's just something that people have to be aware of. So we saw that you're incredibly passionate about using technology as a tool to spread awareness. So like specifically, you said that you researched the portrayal of depression in video games and emphasis on digital storytelling. So how do you think that video games are uniquely a way to foster empathy, and how do they combat stereotyping?
Oh man, throwback to my grad school days. It's been a while now, so pretty far removed, but still something I like to return to every so often. But yeah, so I think the working tenet behind what I was exploring was the concept of empathy. That's, in my opinion, the key towards destigmatization, raising awareness. It's empathy at its base definition is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and experiencing what they experience firsthand. How you react to it, that's not a big part, but it's just knowing someone's story. And a big part of that is that it's impossible to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You can't live their life. So the question is, how can you get the closest approximation to that? So at least a lot of the work I've done and seen is looking at simulated environments, video games, etc., which put you in, and these are more kind of like, and I think that's a whole other thing I'm not going to get into, but like what is the perception of a video game in society. I come from a background of like more narrative kind of base games, like typical Japanese RPGs, Final Fantasies, Kingdom Hearts, what have you. But yeah, it's a lot of just being able to play a character and make decisions from their point of view, experience the story from sometimes literally their eyes, like in a first person view. And what my work at least did a lot of in like the initial stages of it was just doing just a bit of a comparison. Because again, nobody can definitively say like, oh yeah, video games are full of promoting empathy. Causality is a very hard thing to establish across anything. But it's one of those things looking at in comparison to other media like books, movies, television. Every one of them, every media has their own affordances, but I think one of the unique aspects to video games, simulated environments, especially going into virtual reality, is the inherent factor quality of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, literally. And having more of that agency to control what they do and where they go, you essentially become them. And I think a big part of that then is you experience what they're experiencing. I think one of the, I visited the, I forgot what it's called, the lab up in Stanford that does a lot of this kind of work. And they had one experience where you were put in the shoes of a Black man riding the, I think a bus, and there was just like some itinerant individual just yelling at you for no reason, getting in your face. And yeah, it's again, nowhere close to what the experience would be like. You have the safety of being in a virtual experience, but should something like a conversation come up before, after, you can be like, oh yeah, that's an experience I've seen before, and kind of experience. Obviously, it's not relatable to anything someone else might have gone through, but at least you have a reference point to talk about as opposed to completely being like, I have no clue. And it goes for, so going back to the whole mental health aspect of it, you don't understand a mental health disorder unless you have it yourself. That's just the plain and simple of it. And everyone experiences it in different ways. So for me, like growing up, my mom still has and has major depressive disorder, psychosis, etc. And I know life is difficult for her. She has different ways of seeing the world, and it's hard to relate to, but I can understand it a bit more after I was diagnosed with it myself. So again, a big aspect of it is I'll never be able to see the world from her point of view, but at least I'll understand it from having my own lived experience that's similar. So again, a big part of it is trying to approximate some kind of lived experience that others can just see. And then maybe that'll open the way towards creating at least a degree more of empathy. Maybe one day I'll return to that line of work, but for now, that's well, not in the mood to go back to school quite right now. So,
Us neither.
Sadly, you don't have much choice at the moment.
I agree with what you said. Honestly, it's really interesting because video games give us that opportunity, as you mentioned. Even though we're never going to, going to the example, live life as Black men, we can still experience this simulation. And just having that awareness of the choices that we have, the choices of action, and all the possibilities, the things that could happen, it just makes us have a greater understanding of what people would actually be able to do in these real life circumstances. So, yeah. Um, okay, so I guess we'll wrap up now. But Christian, thank you so much for your time. It's been a joy chatting with you and getting to know your perspective on these really important topics. Um, Before we end this episode, though, what is one thing you want members of the Asian community just to take away from this?
your story is worth telling. Yeah, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Like there have been many moments where I've thought like, oh yeah, nobody wants to hear this anymore. And I've internalized it onto myself. It's just like I'm a broken record. All that worth. It's a journey to try and find it. I'm still in the process of it. It's a lifelong journey, but yeah, everyone's got a story, everyone's got a background, and don't lose sight of the fact that it should be told and heard, valued, honored, respected. Yeah, it's probably the one tidbit I give out there. Throw that in the world, but yeah, no, and thank you so much for inviting me. Great reflective session, and I think the work y'all are doing is fantastic, especially being able to recognize it at high school level. I think it's being able to share that. It's incredible, and y'all should be really proud of the work you're doing. So definitely keep it up.
Thank you so much.